Hey, while we're getting this up here, and a few other people trickling in, there's a sheet passing around, a sign-up sheet somewhere. Here it is. So I know we've been beating this drum sort of incessantly, but we're just trying to check. We for this pilgrimage this summer, Midwestern pilgrimage to some shrines and things, we need 30 people with Pathways Travel to have the bus and all that. And I think we're like 17 or 18. So if you have not yet indicated, if you are interested and have not yet indicated, there is a sheet here to indicate that you would be interested. So basically, we're not going to rent the bus before we know we have enough people to rent the bus, but we want to make sure that we would be at least close to 30 before we pull the trigger. So I'm going to leave this up here. If anybody is interested in that and might be interested in attending, please indicate that, and that'll help us to make that decision. All right. I guess it's that time. Is there anybody standing out there? There's all times somebody. Oh, shut up, Siri. Okay, good.
But just the one coming in.
One more. Everybody stare awkwardly. Make the person feel awkward.
Like that.
So we're gonna pick up tonight. If you got a handout, I'll wait for this whoever's coming to come in, and then we'll say a prayer. So we're not praying as they come in the door. As we're waiting for them to come in, any other questions coming out of last week or whatever? Great. Fred. All right, Fred.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Come on in. I know. We need here. We need more. Here's a couple. There's a chair up here.
Okay.
And there's a chair there.
That's good. We're good.
Here's one. One by Annette.
Okay.
We never know. A couple times last year we opened those. That whole wall opens so we can go deeper. All right. So as we did last week, we're gonna open tonight because it's a class on Our Lady. We're gonna open with a Hail Mary. And I'm going to give you advance warning that next week we're going to start opening class with a Hail Holy Queen. And I'm giving you advance warnings so some of you can maybe refresh your memory of how to say Hail Holy Queen. Okay, so we're going to open tonight with a Hail Mary. So in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now in the hour of our death. Amen. Well, welcome. We're going to pick up tonight, in a sense, where we left off last week. So last week we talked about Mary's, in a sense, her earthly life from the time that Jesus ascended until she, if you recall, what was her fancy term? The Assumption, or there was another word, the Dormition. Remember all that? And so what happened in that sort of window of time, however long that was, because we don't have a date for the Assumption or the Dormition. We do have a date for, obviously, the crucifixion, 33 AD, and then the resurrection about 40 or 50 days after that, because Pentecost was 50 days later. So we don't know what that date was, but let's say it's somewhere in what we might call the age of the apostles. The age of the apostles would be after Pentecost from 33, and then the apostles over the next 20, 30 years or so were active. We know that Peter and Paul were both martyred in Rome around the year 65. I'm pretty sure it was the year 65. That was when the Emperor Nero, there was the great fire of Rome, and afterwards the Emperor Nero blamed the fire on Christians. The Christians didn't really start the fire, but they were convenient scapegoats. And so a lot of Christians were rounded up, Christian leaders, and in the aftermath of that, Peter and Paul were executed. So that was around 65. The other apostles, we don't really know. Book of Acts doesn't describe. In the extra biblical literature, we know they travel all around the ancient world at various places. Stories of some of them going as far as Britain. And You remember one of the apostles went to India? Saint Thomas went to India, took the gospel there. But by and large, the apostles were one by one martyred in various locations. And so sometime in that period of the 50s, the 60s, perhaps the 70s or so, the apostles were one by one martyred. And then we have the last apostle, and that was John, right? And John, the date of John's death is somewhat disputed, but generally thought to be around 90 or so. So near the end of that century, okay, the first century. And I think that's the reason I'm saying all this is because it was very interesting when we start talking about the traditions of the church. Because people talk about, well, we don't know much about the early church, but we have extra biblical writings of the saints and things starting from the year 90 to 100. So it's not true that there was this sort of age where there's no records. We see the age of the apostles up to the latter part of that century, the 80s, perhaps 90, and then we start seeing sort of what we might call extra biblical writings of other church fathers and things, picking up around 90 to 100, 110, and so forth, 120. We're going to talk about that because what we're going to pick up on tonight is Mary's role in the life of the church from that time, the end of the age of the apostles, to, well, up until the modern period. Okay? But to get into this, what I want to talk about, I want to start by talking about math. Okay? Everybody's favorite subject. When I think it was 7th grade, but it's all very fuzzy to me. We had 7th grade geometry class. And I remember more chairs. We got a chair here,
There's one
and there's one over here. Steve,
Where we going, right here?
wherever you want to set it up. So I want to talk about my 7th grade geometry class because I remember the teacher telling us how to compute the area of a circle. And there's a formula for it. Pi r squared. And I remember in 7th grade saying, I'll never need to know this. Right? Why am I learning this? I'll never need to know it. Until like 5 years ago. And we had this giant circular flower bed in the middle of our lawn. And we'd lived in the house for like 20 years, and it was, I don't know, 20 feet across. And we had a tree in it. We finally decided one year, I'm tired of mowing around it. I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to cut the tree out, and I'm going to fill it in. And my dear wife says, well, how much sod should we get? And I thought, I know how to know this. Mr. Garvey from 7th grade, the pi r squared, right? Now, the reason I bring this up in the context of Mary is I want to talk tonight about how our understanding of Mary, our devotion to Mary, the veneration of Mary, the doctrine and theology of Mary evolved over time. And what Protestants would say is then it was invented, right? Because it wasn't in the early church, and now you have all these things that come hundreds of years or thousands of years later, right? Remember we saw last week that the last Marian doctrine, the last time a pope sat on the throne of Peter and pronounced an infallible teaching was 1950. We argued about that. It was 1951, I think it was, or something, right? And that was the doctrine of the adopted assumption, right? Now, Protestants would say, well, look, this is crazy. You're making all this stuff up. The reason I'm bringing up pi r squared, Mr. Garvey, and all of that kind of stuff is, I want you to think about the truths of mathematics. And that nobody really discovered the truths of mathematics. Or excuse me, nobody invented the truths of mathematics. The truths of mathematics over time were discovered. And over time we put them. So, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, you know what the area of a circle was? Pi r squared. Even if nobody knew it was pi r squared, it was always pi r squared, right? The square root of 256 is 16. And it was 16 whether anybody knew it or not, okay? But over time, mankind discovered these mathematical truths that were always true, pondered them, studied them, built on them, so that now we take those simple mathematic truths like pi r squared, but now we can compute all kinds of interesting things, right? Like how to put a man on the moon or whatever. And it isn't that we invented math, it's that those truths were always there, but over time we pondered them, we reflected on them, we went deeper into them. And I'm bringing this up because this is true, I think, in general of doctrinal theology, but many things. We can say this about the Trinity, that reflection on the Trinity over the first centuries of the church leads to the Nicene Creed that we recite in Mass every Sunday, right? That's generated, hundreds of years after Jesus. It wasn't that that wasn't true before, it's that the church pondered those things, right? And in the same way, the things that we're saying about Mary or Marian theology, the big point I want to make tonight is we're going to see that Marian theology, Marian devotion, Marian veneration, all the doctrines of Mary, the role of Mary in the church did evolve over time, but that doesn't mean that it was invented. It meant that we went deeper and discovered and reflected and pondered on these truths and, in a sense, unpacked them. Does that make sense? You with me? Okay. Because sometimes when I've talked to Protestants about this, I felt backed into a corner that you have to prove that everything that we say about Mary today was said, in 50 AD. And of course it wasn't. It was all true then, but we've pondered and reflected with 2,000 years, okay? So that being said, let's talk about how that Mary's, in a sense, role in the life of the church evolved from the first apostolic generation. And the first thing I want to draw attention to is the very famous portrayal of the lady in Revelation, book of Revelation, chapter 12. You remember this? I saw a lady and she had what? 12 stars, right? And this famous portrayal. Now, when I was a Protestant, when I was in seminary, I was taught that that is a representation of the church. That's the Protestant way to read that. That Mary, that lady represents Israel. The 12 stars represent the 12 tribes of Israel. This is sort of Israel and the church. And Catholics, of course, say, no. Now, of course, I understand, just like pi r squared, that we have an understanding of what John is alluding to in chapter 12 of Revelation. And the reason I brought this up, and I brought up the dates of John and the apostles, is what I want to suggest is that by the year 90, by the end of the apostolic age, when John is writing and sharing the book of Revelation with the church, there's already this growing awareness of Mary. And so we see the lady, right, with the 12 stars and the whole 9 yards. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but you know what I'm saying, right? Now, at that time, did the term Queen of Heaven, was anybody using that? No, they weren't. As we'll see over the course of this evening, that terminology, things like Queen of Heaven and all these sort of things, develops over time. But you can see, in a sense, the preliminary infant elements of it are there, right? So John has this vision and he sees the lady with 12 stars and he sees that. At that time, the church had not yet fully reflected on what that vision meant, but that vision was there in its infant form. Does that make sense to everybody? You tracking with me? So we can already see, I would say to the Protestant who says, where does this Queen of Heaven stuff come from? I go, well, look there. That was already a vision that was there, although people didn't fully and completely perhaps comprehend. They didn't have the hundreds of centuries and centuries of reflection on that emerged. I remember somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody I was reading made an interesting point. They said, who knew more about the Trinity? St. Peter or St. Thomas Aquinas? And you go, well, St. Peter knew the Trinity, right? He was there. He was there at the Mountain of Transfiguration, saw the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? He had an intimate knowledge. But he didn't have 1,200 years of reflection, and he probably couldn't explain the Trinity in all the complex ways that Thomas Aquinas could in the Summa Theologica, right? And so it isn't that that wasn't there, but over time we have the benefit of it being what? Unpacked. Make sense? So already these ideas of Mary are there, I would suggest, right, by the end of the apostolic age, because John's sharing it. Now, let's talk about the first images, Marian images. And I think these are really interesting because how Marian imagery has changed. So when we see beautiful paintings of Mary or representations of Mary today, in some ways there's continuity. We see also sometimes her represented in ways that maybe she wasn't represented in the first century. And again, I'm not saying that that changed, but that we have this kind of growth and reflection. So I put down here what are purportedly the first visual representations that we know of Mary in church history. Now, I want to start with the second. There's two on the side here, if you have the handout. And they say Marian paintings in the catacombs of Priscilla. So you go to Rome, and there's all these different catacombs, catacombs of Calixtus, and the catacombs of Priscilla, and the catacombs of whatever. And in the catacombs of Priscilla, there are several paintings. Now, obviously, they're frescoes, and they've, been eroded and things over time. But what you see there are at least two in the catacombs of Priscilla representations of Mary, and these date from probably 130, 140, 150, when Christians were burying their dead down there. So within, 50, 60 years of the Apostle John dying, people were painting representations of Our Lady in the catacombs. Put that in some context. This is 2023. So if we go back 50 years, that's 1973, 1963. So if you say, kind of putting that, right, it would be as if John, the apostles, passed away in the 60s and the 70s, and by now we're already representing. Think within the living memory of people, right? People who were children at the time of the apostles, this is already happening. I could go down a path here that I don't want to take the time to do, but it's interesting how she's represented in these paintings. And like I said, that sort of changes. The one that's on the left, granted they're hard to see because these are screenshots of 2,000-year-old frescoes. But in the one on the left, she's holding the Christ child, okay? And the one on the right, that is the Annunciation. And she's seated in a high back chair while the angel Gabriel appears to her. And in that high back chair, she almost looks, if you look at this, like a Roman magistrate or something, right? And what's interesting is if you fast forward to the Renaissance, and you see, you go to Italy and go to Florence, and you see in Florence all these beautiful Renaissance paintings of the Annunciation. It'll show Mary in a high back chair, like a queen or a magistrate, with the angel Gabriel approaching her. And so that concept of her as, in a sense, a queen, a royal person that's being approached by the angel, is already being painted on the walls of the catacombs, by the year maybe 140, 150. But fascinating. Now, the other one on the left, it says the Salus Populi Romani, and there's a few of us in the room that have seen this. It's in the it hangs in the Basilica of Saint Mary Maggiore in Rome, one of the four papal basilicas. Now, this is the one that I mentioned last time that is purported to have been painted by the apostle, by the gospel writer Luke. Okay, so the story is that Luke spent time with the Virgin Mary. That's where he got her to tell him the stories about the Annunciation and the Nativity and such that are recorded in Luke's Gospel, and that he painted a portrait of her. Now, you can't prove that this was painted by Luke. How would you prove that, right? DNA, I don't know how you would prove it. And the truth is that this painting shows up in Rome in the year 590, okay? There was a pope. It was found on the island of Cyprus. Long story. It was on the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean, and it's brought to Rome by a pope in 590. And you can't. The theory is, when Jerusalem fell and everything else, the painting was sort of smuggled out of Jerusalem, ends up in Cyprus, it's brought to Rome. But it's been in Rome and it's been in Mary Major since 590s, basically since the year 600. And it's called the Salus Populi Romani because in Latin that means savior of the Roman, protector of the Roman people. And so if it's authentically painted by Luke, which how would you prove that it is? But if it is, then this would be the earliest representation of her. And by the way, I thought it's extremely moving to see it. And I've gotten to see it a number of times in my life, and I'm extremely, extremely moved and attached to this icon. And I think there was a very powerful moment when COVID hit Rome a few years ago, and Rome was all shut down. Do you remember this scene? Because Pope Francis had the Salus Populi Romani brought over from Mary Major, and there's a very moving scene where he set it up in the piazza, and asked her and intercede, to as the protector of the Roman people, to protect the city, and I thought that was very moving. So, images of but in that one, notice she's portrayed with the Christ child holding, because the early understandings of Mary, the early representations of her, really focus either on the Assumption or they focus on the Nativity, right? Because she is, right, the mother of Christ. And so the early representations you don't see in the 1st and the 2nd century people writing about the Immaculate Heart or the Mediatrix of Graces or the Queen of Heaven, because those understandings evolve. The focus is on the incarnation. Now, in the Church Fathers, these great ancient writers, right, they start talking about Mary. And I see my friend Ed here. When we start talking about this and we start talking about the understanding of Mary as the new Eve, right? And is this like some weird medieval Catholic idea? Right. So let me back up a little bit. I have Protestant friends, very educated Protestant friends, PhDs from seminaries and all that, who argue with me and they say all of your Catholic Marian hocus pocus was invented in the Middle Ages because the Catholic Church encountered all of these pagan religions, the Germanic pagan religions, the this, the that, the Celts, and they all had goddesses. And so what they did is Constantine, Emperor Constantine, and later Romans took all of these goddess worship that was in paganism and sort of grafted it onto Christianity and made Mary a goddess so that the pagans would be comforted, right? This is standard talking points for Protestant apologetics. Well, here's the problem with that, okay? The problem with that is by the year 160, the Church Fathers are writing about her as the new Eve. So I won't read all these, but Justin Martyr, Saint Justin Martyr, one of the great Church Fathers, writes in the year 160 that she is the new Eve, the first Eve. Her disobedience led to sin and death, and thus there was a new Eve who leads to life, right? And that's picked up by Saint Irenaeus in the year 180. And it's interesting, Saint Irenaeus is writing in southern France, which is a huge Roman colony at the time. And Irenaeus has a book called, or a treatise that he wrote called Against Heresies. And so here he is as one of the Church Fathers in 180 already saying that not only is Mary the new Eve, that to contradict that is a heresy. So rather than the church picking up paganism, it's pushing back against pagan ideas and saying this is the authentic teaching of the church. Now, again, when did I say John passed away? Around 90. So when Justin Martyr is writing this, it's 70 years after that. It's in the lifetime of people who have been children and instructed by the apostles. And, my grandfather was instructed by the apostles, and already this idea is firmly entrenched in the church. So it wasn't some pagan thing that got picked up in the Middle Ages. We can look at Tertullian, repeats the same concept in 200. St. Ambrose in 375 says that Mary is a representation of and mother of the church. Again, these ideas are firmly entrenched. Right? This isn't something that was imposed later. And St. Augustine, I watch my time here, but St. Augustine, for those of you who are familiar with him or not, has a funny role in apologetics between Catholics and Protestants, because Protestants love to quote some quotes from Augustine, because sometimes Augustine says some things that sound kind of Calvinistic. So when I was a student at a Calvinist seminary, we had pull quotes from Augustine. Augustine said this, and that proved that Calvinism, right, is the truth, because Augustine said occasionally things that almost could be sort of construed if you take this sentence as Calvinistic. And you go, yeah, I know, but he wrote you could take his books and they'd fill 2 whole shelves of a bookcase, and you guys have pulled 8 sentences out of him that sound kind of Calvinistic. And so now you're telling me that he's an authority. And this was part of my journey to Catholicism, because I had this pounded into me in seminary. Augustine is trustworthy. Augustine is trustworthy. So I go to Augustine and I find he says things like this. Now, not the visible Son, but the invisible creator of the Son has consecrated this day on which the Virgin, a true but inviolate mother, gave birth to him who became visible for our sake and by whom she herself was created. A virgin conceives yet remains a virgin. That means that the perpetual virginity of Mary, right? A virgin is heavy with child. A virgin brings forth her child, yet she is always a virgin. Perpetual virginity of Mary. Why are you amazed at this, O man? It was fitting for God to be born thus when he deigned to become man. And so, these are all, for me personally, were like the scales falling from my eyes, because I was sitting in seminary, they're going, Augustine's trustworthy when he says things that sound vaguely Calvinistic. I go, well, what about when he says stuff like this? Oh, it's totally wrong on that. Well, wait a minute. Which is it? Is Augustine a reliable source or not? You can't pick and choose, right? So the point I'm trying to just make here is, in the life of what we would call the early church, and what I mean by that is the period sort of before the fall of Rome, right? The fall of the Western Roman Empire. Marian theology is firmly entrenched, even though, as we'll see in the next few minutes, it had not yet been explored and developed in all the ways that it would be. But all the basic ideas, Queen of Heaven is there. You see the concept of perpetual virginity of Mary there. You see the concept of her being consecrated for this purpose. All the ideas, like the pi r squared example I gave you, they're all there. But then over time, sort of geometry advanced to trigonometry, which advanced to, whatever came after that, right? Calculus, right? And so all of that sort of develops. I'm going to pause. Questions, comments about what I just done?
You mentioned about where it was there, and then throughout the years it was pondered and thought. How do we know? How can we be sure it wasn't like that old exercise you do where you put people in line and start the thing on this end and whisper each ear? By the time it's so.
Well, and that would be okay. That's a good question. Okay, and that would be a Protestant argument that it got distorted. Part of the answer to that is we trust that Christ, the authority of the church, and we trust that Christ in his church and the concept of tradition. So that Christ, through the apostles and through apostolic authority, has over time preserved and guarded the deposit of faith in his church.
That's exactly why we believe that it's
Right.
true.
Yeah.
Because of that apostolic authority, which the Protestants don't have.
Correct.
So
Right.
you got telephone with them and
Yeah.
truth with us.
Right. Yeah, and that's the answer, because right. So what their argument is going to be is, well, if it's not in the Bible, then right, and so that leads us back to the argument. Well, hold on a second, right? So that's the answer to that question. Well, we can go down the path of apostolic authority, but yeah, because we believe. Now, I will say one other thing about this evolution of doctrine. So you're gonna have people who say, nobody in this room, I'm sure. But like hypothetically, you would have maybe people who would say, well, if doctrine can evolve on Mary, can doctrine evolve on other things? Like, I'm just saying hypothetically, maybe you're part of the Catholic Church in a Northern European country. And you say, hey, it's time for us to update the church's teaching on sexuality and homosexuality, right? Like that was then, but we know now that the Spirit has led us to the new springtime of the 21st century in which the church is supposed to have gay marriage. Okay, that's what's going on in the church in Germany right now, Catholic Church of Germany, right? And maybe some other places, right? And if doctrine can evolve this way, why can't it evolve this way? There's a very simple answer to that. I think it's simple, but apparently it's not simple, or everybody would agree. But the simple answer is that doctrine can evolve, but it doesn't evolve in a different direction. So we've given the example before. If I take an acorn or I take some seed and I plant the seed in the ground, whatever kind of plant it is going to grow into that kind of a plant, right? An acorn doesn't grow into sweet corn, right? You can't plant an acorn and get roses out of it. It doesn't change. It's nature. The same thing, you have a child is going to evolve. It's not going to turn into a porpoise, right? A human fetus isn't born and then it turns into a turtle or something. It doesn't work that way. So what we look at is a legitimate unpacking of doctrine provides a continuity. And this is, by the way, what Vatican II actually taught. For the people who talk about Vatican II, the Vatican II documents actually teach, right, that there's a continuity of doctrine. And that's what the John Paul II and Benedict taught, who were both there at Vatican II and helped write those documents. That what happens is over time we can say, hey, John describes the woman in the heaven with the 12 stars, and we can see how that evolves into our understanding of the Queen of Heaven. We can see that how the notion of St. Augustine can write what he wrote, what I shared with you about the perpetual virginity and how that evolves into deeper understandings. But that doesn't mean that doctrine can evolve in a counter direction. Okay? I saw other hands.
I was going to say that not only was licentiousness, it was forbidden.
Right.
It wasn't just like evolved later.
Right.
It was actually forbidden, so it wasn't going to evolve.
Well, I have to watch what I say because all this is recorded. Right, but who am I, right? I'm just some lay person in a classroom in Holland, Michigan, right? And there are apparently bishops and cardinals and high positions who would not agree with me, but my response to that is that what they're saying is absurd. With all due respect, Your Eminence, that's absurd. It doesn't make any sense, right? And so to argue that what the church taught about these things at that time, that in a sense the Holy Spirit is doing a complete 180 to argue that the church has been wrong for 2,000 years, is a very different kind of thing than saying John has a vision of a woman in heaven with 12 stars, and that evolves into our understandings of Mary as Queen of Heaven, right? One is a natural evolution or unpacking. One is a maturation, a maturing of the doctrine, and the other is a contradiction. Okay, that probably got me canceled. So let's move on. So let's talk about another aspect of this that occurred very, very significant at this time. So we talked about Augustine in the year 400. Let's skip forward just 30 years after that. And that was the evolution of the doctrine of the Theotokos, fancy Greek word. Okay, Theo means like theology. What do you think Theo means in Greek? God. And Tokos means mother. Okay, or bearer. So here's how this comes about. As I put on the notes here, Christ has, right? How many natures does Christ have? Two natures. He has what? A divine nature and a human nature. But is he two persons? He's one person with two natures, right?
Mhm.
And God has three persons, but Christ is one person with two natures, right?
Mhm.
But the problem is there was this heretic in the early church, and his name was Nestorius. And Nestorius said, well, hold on. Christ has a divine and human nature. In a sense, he has two persons. There is sort of Christ, the Son of God, is a person, right? Second person of the Trinity, Nestorius said. And then there's this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, which is the incarnated word. And in a sense, there's two persons. And what Nestorius said is that Mary is the mother of Jesus. But Nestorius says it's absurd to say that Mary is the mother of God. How could Mary be the mother of God when God is eternal and pre-existent, right? So this becomes like a huge argument. And the emperor, I think it's Emperor Theodosius I, assembles the bishops of the world, and like 200 and something bishops come to Ephesus. And this is an interesting place to have them assembled to talk about Mary, because remember what we talked about last week, that perhaps, maybe, Ephesus is where she spent her last days. And so in Ephesus, but it was a major city in the ancient Greek world, and he calls a council to meet there. And the council declares that, and it gets here this way. It doesn't get here by saying Mary is the mother of God, which is the Protestant argument. They just made that up. That's not what they said. Well, they did say Mary was the mother of God, but the logic of how they got there is super important. So a bunch of bishops didn't go to Ephesus in 431 and say, hey, Mary's the mother of God. What they said is, in deeply reflecting on the person, on Christ, Christ has two natures, but he's one person. You can't divide the natures of Christ. You can't divide him into two persons. When Jesus says the Father and I are one, he isn't saying, well, there's a sort of part of me that's one with the Father, and then there's the other part of me that isn't. And so at the Council of Ephesus in 431, they make a profound statement about who Christ is, that his two natures are held together in one person. You can't divide that. When Christ appears at the Transfiguration, he isn't saying, okay, now what I'm doing is I'm showing you my divine personhood. And then when this is over, now I'm like Jesus of Nazareth. And then they say, well, if Christ's personhood can't be divided, right? And if Jesus of Nazareth, that man, was one person with two natures, and Mary was the mother of that man, then in a sense, she is the mother of the Christ, including his divine nature. Now, they didn't say Mary is the mother of the Father. They said Mary is the mother of the Christ, of the Logos incarnated, which makes her, in a sense, the God bearer. And tokos in Greek, the connotation of mother, maybe it's closer to bear. It's like the one who bears, like in the sense that the mother bears the child, that she was the God bearer. She bore God into this world. And they declare that in 431. And then about 120 years later, at Chalcedon, which is a suburb of Istanbul or Constantinople, the Council of Chalcedon, I think 451, reaffirms this. And so this title that Mary is the God bearer is accepted by the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Anglican Church, and the High Lutheran churches, and it's rejected by other Protestants. And again, what we're saying is way back when people were painting in the early 2nd century on the walls of the catacombs, this picture of Mary bearing the Christ, okay? Way back then, that idea, just like my example at the beginning about pi r squared, that was always there. But as the church reflected more deeply on the person of Christ and reflected more deeply on the incarnation, on what it meant for Mary to be the mother of Christ, the church came to this deeper realization that therefore that makes her the God bearer. Does that make sense? So it wasn't invented. It is that further unpacking of that truth that was already there. And I think this is interesting. So I'm going to try to show you this. I should have had this like a big picture. Look at the Salus Populi Romani thing. And if you have, I don't know, if you don't have any of your eyes are terrible, so you probably can't see it. But look at the picture of Jesus. Now, this is a really funny thing when you look at ancient Christian art, especially Eastern icons. Okay, so and medieval, like when I say Eastern, I mean Eastern Orthodox icons, and to some degree the early Middle Ages. Whenever they show the baby Jesus, he looks like a little 40-year-old man, right? It's sort of weird looking, right? Have you ever seen this? You go see these Eastern icons and they're super beautiful and all this stuff. And there's Mary, and then there's like this midget, right? It's like this, it's super weird. It's like he's like this tall, but he's like a 40-year-old man. It's like this guy looks like he's got the beginnings of male pattern baldness. And he's just like sitting on her lap and he's like this tall. It's sort of weird, right? And you see this in all the ancient iconography. And it's sort of like goofy, right? When you first see it. But then, you know, what you understand is they are trying to picture, right? In a very simple way, how do you represent that he's little, but he's God?
Yeah.
So what you do is you draw him as Jesus, you just make him tinier, right? Put him on underneath. And right, and so it made sense within that sort of visual language to go, oh yeah, I can get it. The little 40-year-old guy sitting underneath, that's Jesus when he was little, right? But the reason I bring that up now is that, right, that idea that she is the bearer of God is even visually represented in this iconography, in that he isn't just some little, he is an infant, but they're trying to communicate through the art that he's more than just the infant Jesus, you know, the human infant Jesus. He is also at the same time, he is the bearer of God. In fact, he has a little toga on, right? You know, right? And so I said, you go like, what? They're a 40-year-old midget with a toga on there, and that's the reason why. This is, by the way, when art is incredible, is what art is able to do is visually or artistically represent things that are conceptual. So, you know, some of you have heard me talk before about Michelangelo's Pietà, right? And how the Pietà presents Mary as like this this like teenage girl with this giant guy in her lap, right? And it's a little weird, right? And you go, well, wait a minute. The time that Jesus was crucified, Mary wouldn't have looked like a teenager. But of course, what Michelangelo is communicating is that at the moment of Mary's fiat, at the moment of her saying yes at the Annunciation, she was saying yes to where that would lead, right? And this is what art does so well, is it communicates concepts that would take you. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Take me 1,000 words to say it, but if Michelangelo says it with a statue, or you put a little 40-year-old guy in a toga on Mary's lap, and you go, see, she's the bearer of God.
In the middle picture, who's the third figure? What is that?
I think it's supposed to be the shepherds or the wise adoring. I think it's supposed to be the nativity. It's supposed to be her at the nativity. Maybe that's the shepherds or something. So again, this whole notion of Mary as the Theotokos is this further unpacking, pondering, reflection, investigation of the truths of the faith in Christ and who he is and who Mary is, and it continues to sort of unfold deeper and deeper and deeper. And this is how the Marian doctrines, in a sense, evolve without being invented. Okay? Questions about the Theotokos thing? Make sense?
Makes sense.
Now we come to the Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages are generally from whenever you decide that the Western Roman Empire fell, and there's arguments about how that should be dated. But one date that's often given is 410. up until, and pretty well agreed that the end of the Middle Ages was the fall of Constantinople to the Muslims, the Turks in 1453. So here's the takeaway I want you to do. So I, in graduate school, I kind of majored in partly medieval history, theology, philosophy. So I spent a lot of time talking about the Middle Ages. I'll never forget I had a grad school class in the Middle Ages. I mean, I was a young guy or whatever, but I'll never forget the way the professor put this, and it's just stuck in my head wherever. He said, the Middle Ages lasted over 1,000 years. And to wrap your mind around the time since the Middle Ages, the Middle Ages lasted twice as long as the time from the Middle Ages to now.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right? So if you think now, like here we are, it's 2023, you know, blah, blah, I have an iPhone, right? Middle Ages, that's like ancient, you know, whatever. However long you think that was, like 500-600 years, the Middle Ages were twice as long as that in them. It was a huge, enormous span of time, right? And so anything that you talk about that evolved in the Middle Ages, medieval theology and philosophy and devotion and art and the church, you know, it's just so unfair because people just throw out stuff about the medieval church or the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. And it's just like a really goofy thing to talk about because you're talking about something that's 1,000, 1,200 years of complexity. But be that as it may, let's talk about some things that happened during that vast period of time in terms of Marian theology and devotion. So during that time, there are further theological reflections and debates on Mary's nature and role. So, you know, we can see here from the Council of Chalcedon in 451, we kind of move into the Middle Ages, and there are all kinds of medieval theologians, doctors of the church, popes, pastors, right, philosophers that continue to write, debate, think, explore about Mary and Christ and her role. And so there's a great evolution of that, which really, by the way, reaches, I believe, its pinnacle. If you want to say where the high watermark of medieval Catholic thinking is, and I might argue the high watermark of Catholic thinking is St. Thomas Aquinas, right, in the 1200s, and this is early 1300s, and this is really where you really reach the pinnacle of 1,000 years of people sort of thinking about thinking. So Mary evolves, but here's some particular things that happen during that time. New titles are given to her. Bernard of Clairvaux began to talk about one of the great saints of the Middle Ages, began to talk about things like the mediatrix, that she is in a sense a mediator of grace. Now the full mediatrix doctrine continues to get unpacked, but things like that. Other kinds of titles, they begin to talk about the Queen of Heaven during this period, right? Talking about her in terms of Our Lady is a very interesting thing. So obviously people always would think that, but one of the things that occurs in the Western Middle Ages is this evolution. C.S. Lewis writes about this. He talked about in the Middle Ages, they developed an idea of the lady, of a lady. So like in the ancient world, you talk about women, but there's this ideal of the lady. And this is where chivalry comes from in the Middle Ages. The idea that there is an ideal of not just a woman, but of a lady. And she is a sort of, that's an ideal of virtue and grace. And there's a sort of interaction in medieval chivalric thought between this evolution of the concept of the chivalric lady and the lady, right? And so the more people sort of reflect on the Blessed Virgin Mary as the epitome of feminine grace and virtue, then that begins to be sort of an ideal that you want to think about, that there should be this concept of the lady, and that people should be honoring that, and then that goes back. So, it's interesting, like in the Middle Ages, you still go to Europe, we go to Western Europe, and we go to various churches or castles. And a lot of times in a castle, whatever, where you have these chivalric knights, they would have a lady chapel. So this is a small chapel dedicated to Our Lady, and the knights and stuff would go in there, and there was this concept of so so Mary begins to play a more and more sort of elevated role in the imagination of the Middle Ages. Okay, and art and architecture and literature begin to reflect this deeper understanding. So people begin to write medieval poetry, and they begin to do medieval painting, and the beautiful medieval Gothic cathedrals and stained glass, all of these things, and this concept of Our Lady begins to play a larger and larger role. So you can go to, some of you have been to these great Gothic cathedrals of the High Middle Ages and seen the amazing stained glass and the wonderful things and the representations of the Blessed Virgin Mary in these things. And you see things like, for those of you who were last year in the class I taught on Dante and the Divine Comedy, that this notion of the lady, in fact, right, remember, this is Dante, who is kind of the greatest poet of the Middle Ages, greatest writer of the Middle Ages, who remember, he goes on his tour, and the Blessed Virgin Mary sends Beatrice to guide him. And then eventually, as he gets up there, he ascends to, remember, the white rose of the beatific vision, and there is Our Lady at the pinnacle of it. And so this is profoundly in the imagination, and it works its way into literature and music and art and architecture. The naming of churches, you start seeing churches named more and more for Our Lady. And this deep devotion to her, religious communities devoted to Our Lady, male and female religious communities, and she becomes the protectress of various cities. And here's an interesting piece about that. So this little thingamajig here, you all seen this, right? It's the fleur de lis. Anybody know what it's supposed to represent?
Flower
A lily.
Lily.
And lilies are a representation of Mary. So this is a stylized lily, and actually the fleur de lis originally was a Marian symbol because it's a stylized lily. And so the Kingdom of France in the Middle Ages adopts the fleur de lis as its symbol because the Kingdom of France is dedicated or calls upon the Blessed Virgin Mary, Our Lady, as its protectress, its patron. And there's another, and this is, it's not the only place, by the way, that uses the fleur de lis. There's at least one other place that uses the fleur de lis, or used the fleur de lis in the Middle Ages as its national symbol. Anybody know where that was? A few of you have been there, as I went there with you. City of Florence. City of Florence. If we're in Florence, everywhere there's fleur de lis, because the city of Florence was looked to Our Lady, the Blessed Virgin Mary, as its protectress, and so it uses the fleur de lis, the stylized lily, as a
Is it on
symbol.
their flag?
What's that?
Is that on their flag?
Man flag, and you see it plastered all over, like when you walk to the palaces and stuff like that. And so this idea grows. There's liturgies and feasts and religious festivals to Our Lady, explodes in the Middle Ages in ways that it didn't. And again, it wasn't that these were invented. The early church, as I tried to point out this evening, the early church had all of these ideas in their infancy, but in the Middle Ages, they really come to the forefront, and you begin to have all of these dates on the liturgical calendar, and feasts and festivals and everything around Our Lady, popular devotions and venerations, pilgrimages to Our Lady, prayers to Our Lady, and then, of course, the development of the Rosary at first in the Middle Ages. Okay, so I actually did a whole podcast episode where I talked about the history of the Rosary, and I won't go into it now because we spent 40 minutes talking about that. Ed and I talked about that in that episode. But what's interesting is that it goes all the way back prior to that you had what was called the Marian Psalter, which is that people would recite the words of angel Gabriel in the Annunciation, and they would do that 150 times a day because that's the number of psalm. This whole thing, and the Marian Psalter, and then more prayers are added to it, and so on and so forth. And eventually, through St. Dominic and everything else, it becomes the Rosary, and develops. But all this is taking place during the Middle Ages and the development of the Rosary. In fact, we have the emergence in the Middle Ages of the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Okay, so St. Francis. And you remember St. Francis, that idea, remember I said the chivalric idea of Our Lady? Some of you know something about the biography of St. Francis, right? And before his sort of conversion, when he was a young man, what was he really into? Chivalry, right? He wanted to be a knight, and he actually went off and fought in the battle and got captured and all this kind of stuff. And he was a chivalric knight, that was the whole idea. And he wanted to go out and do battle and have do things for a lady. And then after his conversion, he redevotes that to Lady Poverty. It's a deep devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. So again, these ideas develop. And then, of course, the Franciscans, or that's Franciscans and the Dominicans, St. Dominic particularly founds the order of preachers and uses the Rosary as a way to go out and perpetuate, Christian or propagate Christian teaching. So all of this emerges during this 1,000-year period. And so when we look at the early church, we see all of this in its infancy, but it really, really during that 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, Marian devotion, veneration, the Rosary, all the things we've been mentioning, really explode. Okay. And this is again where Protestants will say, look, all this stuff was invented in the Middle Ages. And you go, well, on the one hand, it did grow in the Middle Ages. That's true. Can't deny that. It really exploded in the Middle Ages, Marian devotion and understanding and veneration, but it wasn't invented there, and its roots go all the way back to the early church. And then you want to get a little history of art and blah blah blah. You go from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance to the Baroque, and all this just becomes like more and more and more and more. It just gets accelerated and accelerated, so that by the Baroque period, which coincides with the Protestant Reformation, Marian devotion is like deeply rooted in Catholicism. And even though it was in its infant form in the early church, it is so interwoven, so much a part of Catholicism. Questions about the Middle Ages and medieval Marian stuff?
It struck me what you were saying earlier about how Marian theology and dogma wasn't invented, it was developed and understood over time.
Yep.
And I think that being that we're just talking about the Rosary, the same can be said about the Rosary, which is a Christocentric prayer, but it's also a Marian prayer. Right. And yep. Our understanding of the Rosary when it was first given to St. Dominic and promoted by the Dominican order,
right?
Our understanding of the Rosary and how it relates to our faith has developed over time. It has, we haven't changed it, but our understanding of it and its importance and what it can mean to the church has consistently from the 1500s grown and developed and then been some would say ratified by apparitions of Our Lady at different sites. At Fatima, at Medjugorje.
Sure. I mean, the rosaries have been added to, right? So we look at the Fatima prayer, and then we look at the luminous mysteries. So those are excellent examples of how Catholicism isn't static, because we aren't frozen in this static thing as Catholics. We understand that the church continues to, and I mean, call me one evolve. Maybe evolve isn't the word I would like to use. I think mature. And as it grows and matures, just as we all grow and mature, we become more complex. And so all these things, again, you think of planting a tree, and over time the limbs grow out and the leaves, and it gets the big oak tree gets bigger and bigger and spreads. And so Catholicism spreads. And so we see even in Marian devotion. You said an interesting thing there about how it's a Christocentric prayer with Mary, and that's really something how the Rosary, if you look at the history of it, and really through the Middle Ages, I think one of the things that happens during the Middle Ages is there is what I'm going to say, not in theology as much, because the theology was always there, but in devotion. People began to understand that Mary is a way for us to,
Closer to Christ.
yeah, sort of a nexus, a way for us to draw closer to Christ, and he draws closer to us through his mother. And I think that was always theologically, doctrinally true in the early church, as I was pointing out earlier. But in the Middle Ages, that sense of popular devotion to her grow. And that brings us to the Protestant Reformation. Because the one thing I will concede, not much, but one thing I will concede is that for every good thing, there's people who sort of abuse good things, right? You know, you always say there's 5% of the people who ruin it for everybody else, right? In anything, right? You go to the beach, you go to the ballpark, you go to whatever. There's going to be the dog park. There's 5% of people who are going to ruin it for everybody else. What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is true that for all the good things that happened in the Middle Ages with Marian devotion and whatnot, there were abuses. Okay? Because there's always going to be some people who ruin it and take it too far. So there were some abuses where there were some distortions and abuses of Marian devotion. And so when the Protestant reformers came along, they wanted to pick on that stuff, right? Look over there, look over there, look over there. And I made a point here on your handout. I think it's a subtle point, so I want to read it, make sure you get it. So the Protestant Reformation was in most instances a complete and violent, and I mean that word actually because there was violence, a violent rejection of Marian devotion and veneration. Here's the point I want to make. The Protestants liked to point to abuses of Marian devotion and use those to condemn Marian theology in general. In fact, I believe that rejection of Marian devotion led to a rejection of Marian theology, but my Protestant friends would say it's the other way around. So my Protestant friends like to think of themselves as deeply intellectual, and that everything that they've done is just driven purely by rational intellectual, right? I have just considered all of the rational intellectual things and have come to this position. I think the truth is that the Protestant reformers looked at abuses that were taking out there, were turned off by those, and then threw the baby out with bathwater.
What were the abuses?
Oh, you know, you can look at even today, you know, you can see the crazy things where people think that, you know, Mary isn't a piece of toast, and, you know, and people are selling the pieces of toast. And I mean, there were people selling relics, and the relic thing was crazy. Everybody was selling vials, not everybody, but vials of Mary's milk. And, you know, and ways where people would take it too far and attribute things to Mary. You know, when they would say that you treat Mary like a god, there probably were some people who had a poor understanding. And, you know, like the church has always been subject to abuse. I'm convinced that 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, people are going to look at the church today and go, do you see the crazy things that they were saying then? Cardinal so-and-so said such and such, right? So, you know, they were trying to do gay marriage 500 years ago in the church. So, right, there are always distortions, and there were distortions in those days. But what I'm trying to say is, I think that the Protestant vanity is that we are just purely rational intellectual beings who just considered this theologically, and then coming to rational theological conclusions, we then reject your devotion. And I think it really goes the other way around. I think they were turned off and angry by a lot of abuses in the church, some of which were legitimate. And then they decided, well, because we don't like those abuses, we're going to throw out Catholic theology. So when I think that direction, I can go on about this, about other things too, where I think it went that direction.
Did Martin Luther also reject Mary?
No.
So Luther is an interesting guy about this. Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, Rosemary. So Luther had been a monk. He was an Augustinian monk. And Luther still had in him, pounded in him from his childhood, his monastic, he could sort of never bring himself to say anything bad about Mary. So Luther still believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary. He still believed in Mary as the Theotokos, right? And so of the Protestant denominations, what I would call high Lutherans that still sort of adhere to the original sort of ideas of Martin Luther, are probably the ones. In fact, one might argue that if you look at high Lutheranism, it in many ways it's the closest to Catholicism in some respects of Protestantism. Still not, but Luther still held to some of those ideas about Mary. But the other reformers completely rejected. So John Calvin, throughout the Theotokos, throughout Perpetual Virginity, throughout this stuff, and some of the other Protestant reformers did as well. It's interesting in the Church of England. Oh boy, I'm not even going to open that can of worms, right? But the Church of England, which I don't have a lot of really good things to say about, I'm sorry. Especially while but from the beginning, I mean, all it is the poisoned, the fruit of a poisoned tree, right? Henry VIII wants to get a divorce, and so he invents his own church to make himself his own pope. And from the beginning, he decides the king, the civil authority, appoints himself as the pope of his own church. And so because of that, it's always been corrupted. And where it really gets me is because I studied a lot of this stuff when I was in college and grad school. But Elizabeth I, his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, you'll see her and all that. She was the queen during Shakespeare, when Shakespeare was around that. And she portrays herself as the Virgin Queen caring for the people of England. And really, what it is her sort of knowing that England was a Catholic nation, sets herself up as sort of a competing virginal, basically a competing Virgin Mary. It's super weird. And so the Protestant reformers were all over the board on this, but here's the thing I want to point out. So Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Germany, Wittenberg Cathedral, in 1517. Okay, 1531. Somebody do some quick math for me. That's 15 years? 14 years. 14 years. So in 1517, Martin Luther nails the Theses to the Wittenberg door. 14 years later, Our Lady of Guadalupe appears to Juan Diego. Okay, the Saint Juan Diego, and it's really interesting. We're going to talk about the Marian apparitions next week, so I'm going to save a lot of this conversation for that. But Our Lady always seems to show up at just the right moment. I kind of wish she'd show up now. So we could sure use her in the church showing up right now. But she shows up at just the right moment. And of course, I'll get into all this next week about the Marian apparitions. But the famous tilma, the representation of Our Lady of Guadalupe, then becomes, in a sense, not only in the Americas, where it rallies conversion, but copies of it are made and brought back to Europe, and it becomes a rallying point for the Catholic Church during the Reformation. In fact, in two ways, it becomes a rallying point against the Protestants who are tearing down the Virgin Mary. They go, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And banners are made, and copies of it, the painting represented everywhere. And then also, of course, I'll get into all this next week. It's a copy of it was made and put on the flagship of the Papal fleet when they fought the Islamic army. And so really Our Lady shows up. Yeah, on the ship. We'll get on this next week. On the ship, there was a copy, because it had been just 10 years earlier, a copy of the tilma, Our Lady of Guadalupe, flying on the mast of the admiral thing. And so at the Battle of Lepanto. And so Our Lady sort of becomes a rallying point in the Reformation. And what ends up happening is there's this thing some of you may have heard of called the Counter-Reformation. So the Reformation comes and the Catholic Church says, okay, just like you get served in tennis, they're going to come back. So the Catholic Church comes back with the Counter-Reformation. And the Counter-Reformation is this dramatic reassertion of Catholicism over against, right, in reaction. So all the things that the Protestants were tearing down, what it did, and not just in Marian theology, but in like sacramental theology and 1,000 other things, the Catholic Church in some sense doubles down. It goes, I see your Protestant theology, and and we'll double down. One of my favorite stories about this is there's an author who I like to read, and she made the point that during the Counter-Reformation, right? So Michelangelo early in his career painted the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling, right? And he famously never got paid enough. It's broke. There's a whole crazy thing about that. You watched the movie with Charles Neston about that, right? But then near the end of his life, the Protestant Reformation comes, the Counter-Reformation, and Michelangelo is very old at this point. This one author put it, they said, the Pope responded to the Protestants with his two secret weapons. One was the Council of Trent, where he assembles everybody together. He says, all right, there are abuses in this church, no more abuses. And they did. They cleaned up the indulgences, the money, the this, the that. They enforced priestly celibacy, all the things that were wrong. Bam, 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 bam. But then they doubled down on theological things, affirming the sacraments, affirming the priesthood, affirming this, affirming, and he said that was his one response. And the second was his secret weapon, Michelangelo. And he brought Michelangelo back to Rome and said, I'll pay you whatever you want. Money's not an object. Paint the wall of the Sistine Chapel. And paint the Catholic vision and our response to the Protestants. Now, if you've been to the Sistine Chapel, what's on the wall? The Last Judgment.
Oh, yeah.
It's on the wall of my office. I have a printed on my office here. It's Michelangelo's Last Judgment. It's this magnificent, it's like the size of a tennis court. You just stand there and look at it, and it is the response of the church. And in that painting, which is the size of a tennis court, we go on and on about it. At the top of it, here's Christ, and he's doing the Last Judgment, and some are ascending from the grave, and some are going to hell. And guess who's sitting right next to him?
Right. As the person said.
The Virgin Mary, and she's right at Christ. She's as he judges.
Yeah.
And so this becomes sort of the Catholic Church's response. And so Mary, in fact, instead of the church in response to the Protestants backing off Marian theology, the Counter-Reformation doubles down and deepens Marian theology, Marian devotion, and Marian veneration. Like, okay, Calvin and the rest of it didn't like it. Well, we're taking it, to the next level. And so coming out of that, you have this what's called in art and architecture the Baroque period, and this is where churches go. And this is where we see all this incredible Marian art just exploding. You go to Rome or whatever, and you see this Marian paintings and stuff all over the place, and Michelangelo doing the Pietà and all this kind of thing. It's just magnificent. And so the Catholic Church really doubles down. But Mary, in a sense, then becomes this polarizing figure, because the Protestants said, we don't like Mary. And the Catholic Church saying, okay, let's negotiate some kind of like lesser role for her. The Catholic Church says, we don't like Mary? Well, here's Mary for you. And really that set the tone for the next 500 years until now, which is that the Catholic Church really doubled down on Marian theology, doctrine, and devotion and veneration. And it has been a polarizing thing with Protestants. Which brings us to modernity. Now, when you say modernity, most people think like now, but the word modernity with quotation marks around it, the modern period is generally thought to have begun. When we talk about modernity, what we're actually living now is something called, historians call postmodernity. The modern period really began in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, the Industrial Revolution. When we talk about modernity, typically we'll talk about the Industrial Revolution up until after World War II, when we started entering whatever we are now, which is kind of a postmodern period. But modernity in the 19th century is kind of interesting, because it's the age of the Industrial Revolution. You have the scientific revolutions. So Charles Darwin writes The Origin of Species, evolution. Karl Marx writes, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, and so Marxism. And the whole world is being torn up in the early 19th century. For example, Italy. Italy had never been a country before. There had never been a country called Italy. Italy was a place like a peninsula upon which there were various countries. There was the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was based on the peninsula of Italy. I always give the example, Italy was always like Central America. You know, it's like this is isthmus, right? And you go, there's not a country called Central America. Central America is this isthmus between the continents. Make sense? Well, in the same way, Italy had always been this peninsula, you know, the boot, upon which there were various countries and city-states. And a big chunk of it was the papal states, right, that were ruled by the church. We could get into long reasons why the church had civil authority over part of it. But right after the American Civil War, Italy is torn up by a massive civil war by leftists and communists, a leader called Garibaldi, who unites Italy as a country and founds the nation of Italy. So the nation of Italy only goes back to like 1860 something. Okay. But basically, if you were living in Europe in the mid 1800s, mid 19th century, I mean, the world was really messed up. I mean, it was revolutions, scientific revolutions, industrial revolutions, in the explosion of cities and child labor and communism, wars and famines, and basically the whole world was going to hell in a handbasket in the early 1800s. I mean, really, really bad. You think it's bad now? It was like worse then, and way worse. I mean, if you had to say, would you rather have lived in 1823 or 2023? Trust me, we're better off now. Everything was bad. And it is in this period of modernity that then the church decides how to respond to the world basically going to hell in a handbasket. And one of the ways it responds is Marian theology and devotion. Okay? So it's in the early 1800s that the first time that a pope sat on the Spirit and made an infallible pronouncement, and it was the Immaculate Conception. So the church says, I see the world melting down around me. Now that idea of the Immaculate Conception, as I showed you earlier, goes in some ways, the germs of it, the infancy of it, the seeds of it, back in the early church, but it had never been pronounced as a doctrine of the church. It was an idea. And so the Pope in the early 19th century says, world's going to hell in a handbasket, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, Karl Marx, communism, wars, famines, riots, blah, blah, blah. Immaculate Conception. Right? Declares that. And then it was, we'll get into this next week. Of course, it was just a couple of years later. Right after that there's this poor little girl living in a garbage dump in southern France. And Our Lady appears and says, I am the Immaculate Conception, right? So the church during the 19th century, and it's really interesting how the church in a sense responds to that, because it deepens its understanding and its veneration of Mary in the 19th century. So in a sense, the worse the world got, the more the Catholic Church turned to Mary. And you even see that in the beginning of the 20th century, right before World War I, into the 19th or beginning of the 20th century, because you have this whole sort of sense of devotion to the small things, to Mary. So it's in that period at the end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century that we have Teresa of Lisieux, the little flower. And you have, as the world gets more ugly and industrialized, and the world arms for war, and becomes more and more distant from God, and atheism and communism and all these things grow, the more Mary begins to play a bigger role in the Catholic Church, such that even during World War I, we'll get into this next week then, right? So the worst war the world had ever known, right? We'll talk about this next week, but the horrors of World War I were beyond anything that the world had ever imagined. It was a great war. The war to end all wars. No war had ever been as bad as this. And what happens during that?
Our Lady of Fatima.
Our Lady shows up. Right? And says that right at that time, because communism had taken over Russia. Yeah. Great question.
That was before Russia got.
Yeah, right. Well, it was,
Yeah.
Bolshevism was growing
Right.
and right, before the revolution, but Bolshevism and communism was growing and all these kinds of things, and right? So all these things, we'll get into all the apparitions next week, but I guess the point I'm trying to drive is during the modern period, the worse the world got, and the more Protestantism, atheism, secularism, communism, all these things. Now, the Catholic Church, through its popes and its saints and its doctors and its writers, devoted itself more and more and more to Mary. So you see more and more Marian devotion, more and more Marian prayers and chapels and books and 1,000 ways that the church sort of turned to Mary.
Mm-hmm.
And then that brings us now to whatever we're living in now, because in the 60s we hit this, something changes, and we have the sexual revolution, and we have these things. And I think I'm going to, kind of end here tonight, because, it's hard to talk about history when you're in history. You need a couple hundred years of distance to know what's going on. So it's hard to say what's going on right now, but I do think something very interesting, and that is that what I try to portray tonight is that for 1960 years, the church increasingly turned to Mary.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sexual revolution hits.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I wonder whether Mary's role in the life of the church, not individual Catholics, but the role in the life of the church, interesting to see where that's going, right? Mm-hmm. And whether or not 100 years from now, we'll look back at this period and say Marian devotion increased, or did it decrease because it was challenged by all of these postmodern ideas? And, I think that the sexual revolution in particular is something that challenges at a very existential level, the concept of Mary and the purity of Mary and these things. And so now we see the meltdown of the family, and we see all kinds of things that really challenge Mary. So we see the growth of abortion and euthanasia and all of these things. And so this is a very, very dark time, and same-sex marriage and all these things that seem to be like everything that you would say for 1960 years that in a sense Mary stood for is all under attack, both outside the church and in some parts of the church inside of it. And so it's really interesting to project, not in our lifetimes, but 100 years from now, when we look back at this time, it would be a really good time for her to show up again with another apparition and give us some guidance.
You see the seeds of a resurgence of devotion to Mary and the Rosary, that were begun by St. John Paul II in his 2 encyclicals, one about the Rosary, one about Mary, and then you see that carried on in Pope Benedict the 16th. You see the glimmer of that light, that fire being fanned, that flame being
absolutely
fanned.
Look, there are parts of the church where Our Lady holds great sway and influence, and then I think there are aspects of the Catholic Church today where everything that she maybe give a lip service, but as everything that she has stood for 2,000 years is being overturned and eroded. And so we live in interesting and complicated times. But as we get into next week, like the apparitions, and hopefully what you saw tonight was that for 2,000 years, whenever the church was challenged, it in a sense turned to Our Lady and deepened its devotion to her. And so, we're right in the middle of this thing that's been lasting a couple of generations. It'll be interesting to see whether we continue to turn to her, or who knows whether she shows up or what happens. But clearly, I would say that in some sense, the things that Mary represents and stands for are being challenged outside the church and within the church in ways that they almost maybe have never been in history.
Almost what? Did you say? Almost,
or maybe have in ways that they've sort of never been in history before with some of the things. I mean, we're facing things that you know, in some ways are different than the church has ever faced before when we look at the 21st century and postmodernity and the erosion of the human person and biotechnology and 1,000 other weird and ugly things that are eroding. You know, because at the core of who Mary is, right, is the dignity of the human person. You know, she as the bearer of Christ, and she as our mother, the mother of God, but also the mother of the church, right? Our mother, that in a sense, all of those things that she stands for, the dignity of motherhood, the dignity, the virtue, her virtue, I should really be careful about the things I say because I'm afraid it's kind of on YouTube. I'm going to get burned, but right. So like, what do I hear? So yesterday, or was it yesterday today or whatever, I was looking on Twitter or something, and there's some story, and now the big thing are these gay men who order designer babies, right? And so there was this big story about these two husbands or whatever, and there's catalogs now where you go, I want to shop for a birthday, you know, and like, you know, I want her to be, you know, this and that. So these two husbands or whatever are going, hey, you know, we want, you know, and so we shopped for a birth mother with the characteristics that we want, and we did this and that, and then we hired her, contracted with her to produce our baby or gay baby, whatever, gay baby or whatever it is, right? And now, and then they're sitting there and they're in, and for some reason, all of these pictures of them, and I've seen multiple ones, like we have a high government official that did this in the federal government, and all the pictures of them, they're always like in a hospital bed holding the baby. And go, why are the two dudes in a hospital bed? No, neither of them gave birth. Why are they sitting in a hospital bed? Like, I don't. What is this, right? It's like posing motherhood. And then the even weirder thing that I saw like 2 days ago was that, and I told my wife about this, and she's like, I gotta go to the Secretary of State and change my driver's license. So you know when you sign up to be an organ donor, that now what they're gonna do is you're gonna take with like dead women and donate their organs or their uterus, their womb, to like a trans dude. Oh. Right, so that the idea is that a guy could have a transplanted womb in him, and my wife's like, yeah, no, I'm going and changing my organ donation because I don't want some trans guy to have a womb. And you know, all of it is, like I said, absurd. Except the thing that I think makes me sad is all of this is like a giant gesture. You pick your idea of a gesture, right, but a giant gesture to Our Lady and everything that she represents.
You can see that.
And our society is just throwing a giant, you know, just hand gesture up to Our Lady and everything that she represents. And so this is an interesting time to be alive. And because I you know, I'm devoted to Our Lady, I expect her to respond. I would love to have her show up as she did for Panama, but you know, Guadalupe, but it's about time. But you know, you know, look, so these are just interesting times. But anyway, I hope that you got the sense. So I'm going to stop talking and take you to go a couple minutes. Any questions, comments?
You know, also at one time, I would think Protestants would maybe pick up a little bit on this. I don't know if it's Greek terminology, but hail, full of grace, Hail Mary, full of grace. Hail is the, you know, what you call for royalty, queen.
Well, it's Salve.
Salve, all right.
So right, so that's why it's Salve Regina.
Right.
So it's the Roman. Actually, in Latin, it's just the greeting. So, but of course, that's in Latin. But Mary probably spoke Aramaic. So when the Angel Gabriel showed up, I assume he spoke it in Aramaic. But your point is that hail, that Salve, that greetings. Yeah, I'm not sure where I go with that in terms of how that's translated, but it is hail, and then I think there is that royal element. Yes, I get where you're going with that, and that's why I think, like I said, you see from the various early earliest artistic representation.
That's
This,
why some of my.
yeah, you know, or Mary is always, go back and look at like these Renaissance depictions of, or medieval depictions of the Annunciation, Fra Angelica, or Da Vinci, or these things, and Giotto or whoever. And Mary is always seated in this high back chair, portrayed as a like aristocratic lady or queen. And then the angel Gabriel, instead of being like coming down or whatever.
So.
I'm watching my time.
So-
That gets me. Okay, so I know it's super popular to look at stuff like The Chosen and all these things, and they're really well done, all these movies, right? But you always can see like the Protestant movies about that. Like in the Protestant movies, Mary is always this like poor teenage girl living in a hut.
Yeah.
And then like what happens is a bright light shines in from above down on her. And then she's like, right? But it's interesting because in all of the Catholic representations of art, right, of the Annunciation, Mary is always saying, and the angel Gabriel is on his knee coming before her, looking up to her rather than looking down on her. And it's super interesting. Like, and again, The Chosen is very well enjoyable and very well done and all that. But it's interesting that sort of Protestant representation always puts, like, reverses the status.
Turn it around.
Yeah,
And also the Queen Mother in Stalin.
Yep.
Was the mother.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Any other questions or comments? What?
Just a comment on the last, half the line of your third page there. Everything Catholicism still holds on to. Over the next couple of years, the Synod and the Vatican and where that could very well be going is really bad. We should be praying for it.
We should be praying for the church, and we should be
Yeah.
praying for the, and I'm assuming we all pray for the Holy Father every day and his intentions, and so pray for the church. We should always be praying for the church.
It's really scary when you read about what's going on in some of those, even cardinals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're human.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, if
Pray for
they
the
have
church.
their way,
And ask Our Lady to pray for the church.
yeah.
Other, okay, great. Hey, thanks for coming. Thank you. Next week, we'll talk about the Marian apparitions over history and how many of them the church recognizes, doesn't recognize. And also, we're gonna, next week, we'll open by praying the Hail Holy Queen. I just wanted to give some people a full heads up on that one, all right? So be prepared to be that. Okay. Which is, by the way, the Hail Holy Queen in Latin, the Salve Regina. Hail Queen.